Okay, tonight we have 3 speakers and a video. We're getting into multimedia. We're so impressed. Our first speaker tonight is Betsy Grimm, and these are all, I understand, members of the church congregation members. Betsy is going to be talking about the early history of this building and this property, which is tied so tightly to all of the Troy community's history, this wonderful dairy barn. Then Esther Cram, who is a former co-worker of mine. Esther is a former assistant director of the Troy Public Library, and I had the privilege of working with Esther for the first, 10 years that I worked at the museum, and we share many great times working together. She's going to be talking about the history of the Emerson congregation, and then the pastor here at Emerson, Suzanne Paul, is going to give us an overview of the Unitarian Universalism that is celebrated here. And then finally, thanks to Matt Champlin, he has put together a short video that shows this church in action. So would you please welcome our first presenter tonight, Betsy Grimm.
Welcome, everybody. Before I actually talk about the history of this building, I would like to put all of this into an historical context. In the 1780s, Congress passed a series of laws that enabled this area to be surveyed by the Michigan Territory, and that did happen. But it really wasn't until after the War of 1812 that settlers came, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was pretty inaccessible before then, but after the war, there were military roads and railroads and steamboat service that came up to Detroit. And the second is that the veterans were looking for a place to settle. Around the early 1800s, there were several settlers, but the one who seems to be the very first is Johnson Niles. And he bought the first piece of property in 1819. He came here with his wife and children and on a steamboat because he was from upstate New York and the Erie Canal connected. And in fact, many of the settlers, the early people, came here from upstate New York. He was a farmer and a businessman and became pretty well known around here and became a congressman and senator when the territory became a state. At the time he came, the properties were about $1.25 an acre, and there were different size properties, but most people chose about an 80-acre lot. And the communities, the small communities that were developed was Troy Corners, Big Beaver Village, Halsey Corners, and some others. The businesses had their ups and downs, mainly because of 2 factors. One, there were economic hard times in the United States during that time, which of course influenced them. But the other thing is that in the 1840s, the Detroit to Pontiac Railroad was established. And being that it didn't come through here, there wasn't as much development, whereas the communities along that railroad did develop. Still, the farmers that live here prospered. There have been 3 different owners that I could identify that owned this property. And the third one was William Lakey, and he's the one that built the barn. He was born in 1855 in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and he came with his family here when he was about 10. And he married Esta Niles Lakey. The name sounds familiar. It's the granddaughter of Johnson Niles. He and his wife had 5 children. When he built the barn, he used heavy timbers from the Niles Tavern, which was built in 1817, so I presume that came down and the timbers came here. And there are some pictures of the rafters and what it looks like up above us over here at the side. I noticed some people looking at, please come and look if you haven't seen these things yet, because they really they're a nice history in and of themselves. What made this such a great location for Mr. Lakey was in 1898, the Detroit United Railroad was completed. And it was a consolidation of several interurban railways that were headed this direction, so that there was one solid line that started at Detroit and wound around through the communities we know up to Rochester. And I believe ultimately it went beyond Rochester. It had a service for passengers, but freight service as well. So that Mr. Lakey, as I say, chose an excellent location because the platform was right out there. And he was a dairy farmer, as were many of his neighbors, and they were able to take their milk to the platform and have it taken to Detroit and then have their milk cans returned every day. So he did very well. There are a couple of photos over there that show that his times, and one of them that I really like is he's on a Fordson tractor. And it was built in 1917, and it was among the first things that were built by Henry Ford. And to me, it symbolizes that he was sort of a forward-looking farmer for having modern equipment. And it was also another sign that this area really was excellent farming area and that the farmers did very well. In 1928, two gentlemen purchased the barn. And I presume Mr. Lakey wanted it to retire at that time. He would have been in his 70s. And these gentlemen gave the barn to the Presbytery of Detroit with the intention that it be a church, which it was. The Presbyterian Church was established here, and it's now one that congregation is right up the road, up Livernois. They spent $13,000 to remodel it. This used to be the hayloft, this sanctuary. Down below was the dairy barn, and then there are other improvements that are obvious for rooms throughout the building, and they put the steeple up, and the silo was taken down. So I will now turn the microphone over to Esther Cram.
I'd like to talk to you tonight about the congregation. And, you know, many times in religious groups, there are disagreements. And so a congregation has a split. There was a split at the Birmingham Unitarian Universalist Church. And that split had to do with the hiring of a new minister. And again, this is an old story to those of you who may have heard of such things happening in churches. I call them holy wars. Little things like this happen that people just can't agree that a change is a good thing. So this group happened to be mostly young couples, and many of them had children. So it seemed as though that might not be the best group to actually start a new congregation. But as it turned out, it was a very successful group of people. They really stuck to their guns. So this happened in May of 1962. The group got together in one of the couple's backyards, and they kind of picked people to do different things, and elected a treasurer, elected board members, people to run the business of the church. And they found a place to meet. They happened to meet at Emerson School in Royal Oak, and that's where our name comes from. Of course, there's also a connection to a guy named Ralph Waldo, too. In 1962, they called themselves the New Unitarian Church to distinguish themselves from the Birmingham Unitarian Church. And then again, in the next 10 years, things changed some more. First of all, they changed their name again. There was a lot of name changing going on. They decided that since they met at Emerson School, they'd call themselves the Emerson Unitarian Society, and they moved to Morse School here in Troy. And a lot of you probably know where Morse School is, over near the post office. That move was made in 1968, I think. Later on, they decided they would move to the Stagecrafters in Clawson. So this group really got around. Took them a while to come over here, didn't it? Then for the next 10 years, they had another name. they called themselves the Emerson Unitarian Universalist Fellowship to distinguish themselves from a congregation. Fellowship being a smaller group with different purposes in mind and probably not always being led by a minister. Then they changed their mind again. In 1983, they became the Unitarian Church. Now, along the way here, the Unitarians in this country and the Universalists in this country were talking about joining forces and finally did so. So that finally in 1983, this congregation came to be known as Emerson Church Unitarian Universalist, and I'm very relieved to say that we haven't changed our minds since then. It's a good thing. So we're still using that name. Now, Betsy talked a little bit about the property here. In May of 1967, they were looking for a place and decided that they had enough money to actually buy some property. So they went over to Waddles Road, just west of Rochester Road, and they purchased 4 acres for $18,000. Seemed like a good deal. And they thought about, building a church. And in the meantime, I guess the Presbyterians decided that they were going to move on. And so in 1971, they instead purchased the Presbyterian Church, where we are right now, for $65,000. Also, I think a good buy. In November of 1971, shortly thereafter, they sold that 4-acre site on Waddles Road to the American Lutheran Church, and they made $4,000 because they sold it for $20,000. In 1972, they had a 10-year anniversary, and there's a lithograph that was donated, presented as a gift from the Birmingham Unitarian Church. So I guess they kind of patched up their differences. And that lithograph is in our lounge, and it has a picture of some of the luminaries of the time of Ralph Waldo Emerson, like Longfellow and so on. And if you look in that picture, and then you look at the bottom, you'll see the names of a lot of very famous people, writers and thinkers of that time. In 1973, they had a 2-day lift-off project in the basement. The entire basement floor needed to be lifted off, and they used circular saws and crowbars to do this job, and then they put down a floor. I don't really know what was there, and I'm kind of curious. I'd like to do a little bit more research to find out when did they actually take out the stalls. I'm not sure about that. Anybody know that? Is that when it happened? That's when it happened. Okay, and in 1974, you might be interested to know that we had renters here. And the renters of the church at that time, 1974, included a Pentecostal church and the Wood Glen Nursery School. And in our basement, there are some accommodations that were made, obviously, for a nursery school, because we used to have, we still have a restroom that is definitely designed for small people, and we even had some of our furnishings and sinks and things were designed for small people. So that was a source of rent for the church. In 1977, the renovation committee formed, thinking that they needed to upgrade the church, and they spent some time and effort in raising a lot of money, and a lot of improvements were made here, including making this a handicap accessible church with an elevator and a restroom on the first floor, widening of the stairs going down to the basement. You felt like, I assume you felt like you were going down into a cellar with very narrow stairs. In 1978, you people, the Troy Historical Commission, unveiled and commemorated our historical plaque or marker. It's in our front yard as you came in. It's on the left in the front facing Livernois. A very interesting thing happened in 1978 also. In the fall, there was a drive to raise money called SOS, which was Save Our Steeple. We had to raise money, and the repair bill was $6,825. And we saved our steeple, and we don't have a bell on it or anything. At one point, the youth group felt we should have a bell, but they didn't have a lot of money to put a big bell in, so we have a small bell. This one that you just, a handbell, but it's engraved with that information. In 2007, we also sold the back of our lot for $97,500, the southeast corner of the property, to the neighbor who lives right there. Now, bringing you up to the present, we have a beautification and painting project going on right now. We'd like to get ready for 2012 when we'll have our 50th anniversary celebration. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm the Reverend Suzanne Paul, and I am the half-time consulting minister here at Emerson Church, and I'm just delighted to see so many of you here this evening. We are, on behalf of the Emerson Church, I want to welcome you and thank you all very much for coming. We have over a 500-year history, and so that would be a long story. So I'm going to try and condense it this evening and give you just the overview of Unitarian Universalism. Many people that I have run into over the years think that Unitarian Universalism is some kind of a cult. And I want to assure you that we are not. Actually, the definition of a cult is a group that hasn't been together for 100 years yet. And we have definitely been together more than 100 years. But I want, as Esther talked about, we did have a merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists in 1961. So this year they are celebrating their 50th anniversary since we had the merger. But I do want to tell you a little bit about the Unitarians first, because they are the older of the two denominations, and then we'll talk about the Universalists. The history of the Unitarians is very much a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And as many of you know, it was St. Paul who was the architect of Christianity. And by the end of the 2nd century, it was larger than any other religious sect of the time. Organized Christianity became more about, over the years, it became more about Jesus than the religion of Jesus. And so one of our famous Unitarians, Thomas Jefferson, wrote a little book, and it's called the Jefferson Bible. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but what he did was he went through the New Testament and he took out all of the quotes that were directly attributed to Jesus, and he put them into a little book, and it's called the Jefferson Bible. And it was because it was his feeling that Christianity had become more about the religion than it had become about Jesus and his message. Well, then in 325 AD, Constantine the Great called together what he called the Council of Nicaea. And it was at that council that they created the concept of the Trinity, which is the three persons in one God, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And at that council, they also created what was called, what we know now as sort of the Apostles' Creed. It was also known as the Nicene Creed as well. Following that was the Protestant Reformation, and along came Luther and Calvin, and they believed very strongly that the doctrine of the Trinity was absolutely essential if you were going to be a Christian. Well, that is when the discontent sort of started among a few of the Christian followers. And so we have our very first Unitarian, actually he became a Unitarian martyr for the cause of unity, one God, and breaking away from that concept of the Trinity. And his name was Michael Servetus. He was a Spanish physician. He lived from 1511 to 1553. And he has become known as our very first Unitarian martyr because he wrote a book in 1531, and the book was entitled On the Errors of the Trinity. So he was taking great umbrage with the Council of Nicaea. And so because of that, he was tried for treason and heresy, and he was burned at the stake in 1553. Well, that name, that Unitarian, unity for one God, gradually became very common usage, and there was quite a following of people who were identifying as Unitarians, especially in the Transylvania area. And of course, our kids in Sunday school love that story when we tell them that our ancestors came from Transylvania. And so that around 1568, less than 50 years after Servetus had been burned at the stake, this concept of this Unitarian thought was now moving into areas of Poland and Holland and England. And at first they were kind of known as the anti-Trinitarians, but they didn't want to really put such a negative spin on their name. So gradually, Unitarian became the word that they were most comfortable with. Some of our famous Unitarians, John Locke, who was an English philosopher, and Sir Isaac Newton, who was a scientist. Around 1620, when the Pilgrims landed here at Plymouth Harbor, Calvinism was the reigning religion of the day here in the United States, which wasn't even the United States yet. And so liberalism began as a reaction against Calvinism. And so that was the beginning of the Unitarian movement in America. They were representing a more liberal perspective on Christian thought. Some of our famous American Unitarians were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, William Ellery Channing, who was the minister of the Federal Saint Church in Boston. So he's very well known in Unitarian circles. May 26th of 1825, the church was organized, and it was called the American Unitarian Association. And their mission statement was to diffuse the knowledge and promote the interests of pure Christianity. Famous Unitarians of that era were Ralph Waldo Emerson, of which, of course, you've heard that we are named, Theodore Parker, Henry David Thoreau, and later Susan B. Anthony. Well, there was a big change in Unitarian Universalism that happened just prior to World War I. And at this point, we were still very much tied to the Christian doctrines, but the world had evolved to a place, they thought, in the early part of the 18th century. What am I trying to say? The early 1900s, that's the 20th century, the early 20th century. I have to remember what century we're in. They thought that all of the scientific knowledge that people had at that time, that the world had probably evolved to a place where there would be a religion without God. And that became known as religious humanism. There were two Unitarian ministers at that time that became quite famous for taking this position of religious humanism. And so Curtis Reese and John Dietrich, they both were preaching at that time that, you know, there were so many discoveries in the world, that so many things now could be explained through science and reason, that the world had evolved to a place where God was no longer necessary. And so the Unitarian Church became a place where Christians, theists, naturalists, humanists, and realists all began to work together. And their mission, they had 5 things that were their mission: individual freedom of belief, discipleship to advancing the truth, the democratic process in human relations, and universal brotherhood undivided by nation, race, or creed, and an allegiance to the cause of a united world community. So around that time, that became somewhat their mission. Okay, so I'm moving on. So that's kind of how the Unitarians evolved into this other perspective of religious humanism, and it began just prior to World War II, and it continues to be somewhat of a mainstay within Unitarian thought to this day. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the Universalists. The Universalists are really primarily a denomination that was formed here in the United States, and so they celebrated their anniversary a few years back of over 200 years. They also were Christian-based, but they believed that everyone had a chance to be saved. You know, the Calvinists had a belief system that there was a finite number of people that were going to be saved, and that number could be found in the Bible. So the Universalists, who had a much more liberal perspective, felt that everyone, that's their name, universally, had an opportunity to be saved and would go to heaven. And so one of the first preachers of Universalism was the Reverend John Murray, and he said, "Give them not hell, but hope." And he said that in 1786 when he formed the first Universalist Society in the Philadelphia area. And he was the first American Universalist minister. I will tell you what their belief system at that time. Their platform was one of faith in general and allows individuals an extensive latitude to think freely, investigate minutely, and to adopt the particular views which best comport with the honest convictions of the mind, and fearlessly so avow and defend the same. So that was sort of the mission, if you will, of the Universalists at that time. The Universalists accomplished quite a lot of things in the United States. They were known for establishing schools, even as far away as Japan. But in 1852, they're most famous for establishing Tufts University in Massachusetts. I'm sure most of you have heard of Tufts. Another thing that they were noted for is that they supported the work of Charles Darwin. They felt that it was not incompatible with the truths of religion. They also ordained the very first woman minister in the United States. Her name was Olympia Brown, and she was ordained in 1863. Around 1900, believe it or not, the Universalists were the 3rd largest denomination in the United States. And it was because they did have a more liberal perspective than other religious traditions at that time, so that made them very special and unique. Clarence Skinner was a Universalist, a teacher and a preacher from 1881 to 1949, and wrote a book called The Religion for Greatness. And in that book, he defined a universal religion that he felt was very compatible with another group, Unitarians. And that was around 1940. And that began the movement toward the Unitarians and the Universalists having a joint endeavor. They had a common heritage, united in one great liberal church. And over a 10-year period from 1951 to 1961, they were in negotiations for the merger. And that took place then in 1961. So this year they are celebrating their 50th anniversary, and next year Emerson Church will celebrate their 50th anniversary. To date, the Unitarian Universalist Association, we are not really referred to as a denomination. We are an association of independent churches, and we have around 250,000 members And it's estimated that there's probably another 250,000 that attend UU churches but have not formally joined. We have 1,041 churches and fellowships around the world, and we are divided in the United States into 20 districts. Emerson is in the Heartland District, and that takes in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And so we are part of that district. Today, what we represent and what we are known for, we are a non-creedal association. We have no salvation message. We have no hierarchy. We are self-governing. We are self-supporting. And every individual UU congregation has the right to call whomever they choose as their minister. I think today within our congregations we find people, humanists, theists, agnostics, atheists. What we really encourage in people is that each person develop their own spiritual life, and we encourage each person in their own personal spiritual journey. So that is my presentation to you this evening, and we are going to conclude this evening with a wonderful video that was put together by one of our members, Matt Chaplin, and we're very excited about it, and I think it best represents this particular congregation. Matt? Oh, can we get in the lights?
Just a little AV stuff right here.
time, so questions for myself or to Esther and Betsy? Nobody has any questions?
How many members here?
We currently have about 65 members, and then probably half again that many who, come on a regular basis who haven't joined yet.
And you said that each fellowship is self-supporting.
Yes,
65 members supporting. This is a bit of a stretch.
yes it is. Yes it is. We have a very generous congregation, and then we have fundraising events as well. But yes, it is.
And that's sort of been our history.
Yeah.
A bit of a stretch.
I've been a member for 34 years, and we go between low of in the 50s to high of maybe 75.
Yeah.
And there's just very good support in what
Yeah.
we believe in.
It's a very, very active congregation in terms of the care of the building, both financially and with their sweat labor. And because we knew we were having you all in April, it was a great incentive to get some things done that we've been putting off. And so everyone's been working very hard to get everything looking really nice. But everyone pulls together as a family. Whatever's needed, it just seems to happen and appear. Yes.
And then Joanne had a question too. So how many ministers do you have? I see more than the face up there.
Okay, because I'm half-time and I'm here 2 Sundays a month, we have 2 retired ministers who come on the alternate Sundays when I'm not here. So Reverend Corrado is here once a month, and he's the retired minister from the Grosse Pointe Church. And Reverend Ken Pfeiffer is here on the other Sunday, and he's the retired minister from Ann Arbor.
And I heard too when I read that we were having cookies, that that's where the brides go. You don't have to walk, you can have a wedding.
We have lots of weddings here. Yes,
It's
yes. Wedding rentals are they really do help very much for revenue for the church, and it is a lovely spot. And people like it because it's historical. They like historical buildings, and so this is a really beautiful place to have your wedding.
There's a lot of churches that you don't belong to.
That's right. And we also have a policy that they can bring in their own clergy if they want to. So they're under no obligation to use me. If they want to bring in someone else, they certainly can do so.
One of the things when the group mentioned that this is a historic building, it is a locally designated historic resource. So that means it's been designated by the Historic District Commission, which is a city council appointed commission here in Troy. Their charge comes by local ordinance, and the local ordinance mirrors the state law. And the state law is from the State Historic Preservation Act. And it's people think that if a building is declared, put on the National Register of Historic Places, that protects it. It does not. Something on the National Register can be moved, torn down, changed completely on the inside or outside. But this structure, because it has local designation, there's teeth in that law. Barb Chambers, who's here tonight, serves on the Historic District Commission in Troy. If the church congregation wanted to change the exterior of this building, say they wanted to put pink aluminum siding on it. Yeah, besides having to resuscitate Barb, it would come before the Historic District Commission, and they would have to approve that before they could pull a building permit. If they wanted to change the roof line and go from that wonderful round roof to a peaked roof, it would have to come to the Historic District Commission to approve it, and they never would. And it would never happen. So there is teeth in local historic designation. Within the city of Troy, there are about now 25 structures that are protected, and the 4 cemeteries are also locally designated historic resources. What we don't have in Troy is a big district like a Heritage Hill, most of our resources are single lot designations. And that's been questioned by the law, but has been found valid. So you really do have a very important structure that has a lot of, an entire ordinance that stands behind it and protects it. And that, their deed is tagged. So in other words, if you ever sold this church to another, back to the Presbyterians, the designation is attached to the deed and would go with it. And the Presbyterians would have to realize that they cannot change the exterior of the structure without approval of the Historic District Commission. The legislation does not control anything in the interior. They can modify the interior any way they want. That another one.
Yes?
How and where are ministers trained?
We have 2 seminaries that are our own, but you can also receive your training in any other seminary. But we have one in California and one that's in Chicago. One is called Star King in California, and the other is Meadville Lombard in Chicago.
How long of a course of study is the seminary?
It's a Master's of Divinity, so that's usually about 3 years. And then you have to do a year of internship and 6 months of CPE, which means you work in a hospital setting. So it's fairly long and involved.
Mom?
You stated that they did away immediately of the Trinity.
Yes.
The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Okay, now, are you saying, I didn't remember what you said when you read your mission.
Okay.
Are you saying that you see your God is in each other and in the creation that you see around you, which is very beautiful, God's trees, His creation, and the creation of the human life? This is your spiritual belief that you don't believe in the Trinity, and you excluded God, the Father, and the Trinity also?
They did not exclude God. It's just up until the Council of Nicaea, Christianity did not have that concept of the Trinity. It was just one God, right? Unity. So the people that broke away were the people who did not feel that that was necessary to have the Trinity. So they took their name from the word unity, became Unitarian. But prior to that was the anti-Trinitarians, meaning that they just didn't abide by that.
I understand.
They felt that it was not biblical based, and therefore it was not something that they needed to
And
follow.
you also stated that one of you gentlemen took out all of the actual words, quotes, that Jesus
Yes.
is saying
Thomas
in the New
Jefferson.
Testament. And do you follow the New Testament all, or just those words?
We are not Bible-based in as much as all of our services are supported by the Bible, but we use the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, for any number of ways in which there's so much knowledge and history and stories in the Bible that are applicable to today's world. And so we use those stories, but we don't rely on it every single Sunday, because we also believe that there's lots of great body of knowledge out there, and wisdom and inspiration and many other sources as well. And so we'll draw from those as well. So when I say we're not Bible-based, I mean every Sunday we don't read from the Scripture, as many congregations do. But we certainly do use many Scripture readings and so forth if it supports the service that Sunday, if there's a particular passage that supports something.
Like, for instance, if one of your ministers, which is a beautiful season, which we have now, of course, it's kind of a flip-flop, that's kind of giving us a flip-flop.
Yes.
It's cold, but this has happened. But what a beautiful season, because even if you look around, the tulips are pushing up and so are the daffodils, despite the fact that the ground is still so cold.
Right.
So you ministers could give a homily or sermon on a Sunday about, without saying anything about the Bible, about this beautiful creation that
Yes,
we have around us.
yes,
This could be sufficient for your people.
yes. If you noticed on the marquee, this Sunday is Easter Sunday, and I'm calling it the UU Easter. And what does Easter mean to a Unitarian Universalist? Well, obviously, our focus is not the same as it would be for an entire Christian congregation. But that doesn't mean that we don't celebrate the message of the holiday, that we don't celebrate the renewal of the earth, the rebirth of the earth, and the joy that that brings to all of us. And so that would be more our focus.
So you don't then follow the fact that the Easter is a celebration, as my religion,
Right.
the resurrection of Christ.
No, we do not.
Okay.
No, we do not.
Any other questions?
Yes.
You talked about the changes made in the basement
Mhm.
and what changes have been made here in this part?
Esther, do you want to speak to that?
You're talking about the sanctuary?
The sanctuary?
Yes.
I'll let Esther speak to that because that happened before I
It
came.
happened, it may have happened before I got here. I don't know, I'll turn to Joni on that.
Yeah, Joni, you want to speak to when this room was done?
Yeah, you can tell me.
So everybody can see you and hear you.
Originally, this was built up to here. Presbyterians had a large stage area opened up and they stored pews and other things in it. So we lowered that down. Did the carpeting. We love the windows and all the wood framing. We went to more simple framing of the windows. The stairs, like in old homes, the 45-degree narrow, this 45-degree angle, widened that about twice, lengthened the treads. I have tiny feet. The other original one didn't bother me, but they were not really very good. Elevator, parking lot. We redid some of the rooms for classrooms, the lounge area.
What about the chandeliers? When did they go?
Chandeliers came in. They had, when I first came, chandeliers had like the candle, they looked like the candles. These came in probably in 1975. A person that is super instrumental, Russ Beckwith, who had been a member of the Stagecrafters, and he's the one who encouraged the group to buy the first set of lamps, and he was just an absolutely wonderful person who could imagine things and then implement them and get people to come along with him. He did this. In fact, we have in the hallway, there's something called the Russ Beckwith Award, and that's given to members of the congregation who have been particularly involved with just adopting this as their special place and involvement. Well, downstairs, we've redone the meeting area. We're working on soundproofing because it is a basement, it is concrete. And there's just always something to do. These windows are lovely, but of course everything here is special, one of a kind size. We've always had lots of people who like to get involved and have the knowledge and working together. And I guess we've been lucky. We do not have the same members that, but everybody who comes in seems to fit in really well. And in the Unitarian Universalist congregations in the metropolitan area, we're of all different sizes. So if somebody is more comfortable in a big church, they go to a larger church. If they're comfortable in being in a small place and being known, and having people to work with, we're here.
Do all of you understand how dairy barns operate? So what had to be converted initially from this? Okay, what you're sitting in now is the haymow. And the ceiling didn't stop there. This has been created. The original barn, this is where the hay was stored, the fodder for the cows in the wintertime. And so this would go right up to the dome. Above this ceiling is an attic area, and I wish it were safe enough that we could take you up there. I've actually been up there. It's the real church. It is cathedral-like. The beautiful arched wooden beams and it's a completely open space. There is no, for those of you who are engineers or builders, there's no cross bracing, no truss work. It is wide open. And in the days of Mr. Lakey, in the fall, this space would be filled with hay, because this is what was going to feed his cows all winter long.
This is probably half of the depth.
Right. Goes, when you go outside and you see the full arch of the roof, imagine this whole thing being filled with fodder. And then there would have been ways that they could, either through conveyor belts or hatches, that they would open up and push the hay down into the stalls that were in the lower level. The cows lived on the lower level, and that's where the milking parlor was. And I don't know if we have permission, but if we could later tonight, if that's acceptable, we can go downstairs. You can see very clearly where there were stalls where the cows would come in to be milked. When they talked about having to raise the floor and put a real floor in, think of the dairy barn. There was a place for the cow to stand, but there was also a trough behind her for excrement that had to be, mucked out. So to turn it into a usable lower level for the church, they had to put a different floor in. So the cows lived downstairs. This is where their food was kept. Okay, does that make sense a little bit more? So we've really, through time, taken a livestock building and a storage building and turned it into a house of worship, which is really phenomenal. And from what I understand, this is the only barn church in the state of Michigan. So it is very unique. Huh? That's being green. That's being green, yes. Any other questions? Well, we certainly appreciate your hospitality and your generosity, your wonderful explanations about the history of this farm that is now, a suburban area and a thriving church. Do take time to look at the wonderful photographs.
We thank you for donating them to us.
The museum, and that's the other thing about our churches, is we've had wonderful cooperative relationships with them. Service projects. I know that the ministers here have celebrated marriages at the museum. We were just talking about sharing parking spaces as the museum expands its programming. Also, images that are so important. For me, as a biologist turned historian, my favorite pictures are the Lakeys running a sugar bush operation. So the farm back out here had a good sugar maple woodlot. And there's pictures of Lakey over an open evaporator boiling down sap on a cold March day. If you think today is cold, make maple syrup outside in March, it's really cold weather. And working on that. So you realize that there was more going on here than simply dairy farming. It was linked to Detroit with the inner urban. It's a marvelous part of our community's history. So please take a look at those pictures. And one that's really special also is the barn standing out in the middle of this open field with piles of hay that have been harvested around it.
Do you know where the house and the Once they melt, then they go into the cooling area. Where was the house?
The family's
That
house?
was the family's house.
Historically, it was across the street, and then at some point it was next to this building where our parking lot is. That one was torn down for some reason, then there was another one there, because there were, and then that one's gone too. But there were two other owners of the property prior to Mr. Leahy that I know, that I could find. There could have been more, but there are two that I could find. Who built the original house. I believe the first one was about 1850, the original, the one I know about.
Keep in mind that the house that is burned down, that's the common way of losing a house around here. Wooden houses burned to the ground, and Troy never had a fire department, as you know, until the 1940s. And if you waited for something to come down a dirt road from Rochester, all they were going to do was, dampen down the ashes that were left. And that's why our volunteer fire department formed. So houses burned down. Also, when Troy became a city in 1955, it was going to be the city of tomorrow today. And they, quite frankly, didn't care about simple, old farmhouses. And they were torn down when they built these subdivisions. So it was a handful of people like Lois Lance and Dorothy Scott who pushed to establish a local historic district designating properties. Very different kind of idea back in the 70s and early 80s. And quite frankly, some of those people were vilified for their efforts. But because of them, we have structures like this. We have the Waddles Home, which has local historic designation, and a number of other structures like the old flower barn up on Square Lake in Illinois is one. And the museum is a historic district. So we have that. It's really important. So, again, if you want to buy tickets for Civil War candlelight tours, we got them in the back.
We're saying Saturday, it's a week from Saturday.
Week from Saturday. Saturday, April the 30th. First tour is at 6:45. If you have any questions about joining the Historical Society Board, Randall is back at the back door. We look forward. Please try to come on the third Wednesday in May to the temple for the last of this very interesting lecture series. And it truly has been the congregations who have made it successful. So thank you guys.